Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to another installment on our lecture series on the French Revolution. This one, we're going to look at the responses to the French Revolution, both from an intellectual sphere and also from kind of a diplomatic angle. And then we're going to look at how then the revolutionaries kind of respond to these European responses to their own revolution, and how that really serves to radicalize the French Revolution even more in the hands of the Jacobins. One response that we can't avoid is Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. Burke was a classical liberal, what we would today call probably a neoliberal. Free trade, a free press, very Whiggish end of the British political spectrum. He supported the American colonists because he did not like the heavy-handedness of the British monarchy. Um, but he opposes the radical qualities of what's going on in France. He believes that change ought to be evolutionary, and it should really reflect the kind of cultural dynamics of a particular country, so that even going beyond the French Revolution itself, when he looks at Napoleon, sort of exporting the French Constitution to other absolutist states to bring them to a constitutional place, Burke says, no, that's not good. Constitutions need to sort of organically rise out of one's culture, and the laws of one country should reflect that country's culture. So he does not like the radicalism, the radical breaks that he sees with the traditions in France, particularly in terms of religion and just custom, banning, for instance, the use of Madame and Monsieur in order to replace it with citizen. Things like that he sees as sort of, in part, window dressing, but also unnecessary. Thomas Paine then goes and responds to that and defends the rights of man. Thomas Paine, of course, who famously wrote The Crisis and Common Sense in defense of the American Revolution. On the whole, however, the British government was reform-minded during this time, but it became increasingly paranoid that French revolutionary activities would be exported to the island of Britain and endanger the British its sort of moderate to moderate conservative political position. And so the government tended to pursue a policy of suppression. Dissenters were seditious. There was a Jacobin lurking under everyone's bed, ready to blow up the establishment and the whole island with it, until all of England was under the yoke of French tyranny, things like that. And we could see sort of just what the British thought of them by this wonderful little political British satire, in which you see Frenchmen without trousers on, right? Because that's a joke against the sans culotte, right? Without knee pants. Well, this is sort of without pants, and they're sitting on the bodies of aristocrats and the treasure of kings, and there's an old crone over in the corner who's roasting a baby over the fire and sort of basting it in its own juices while the children eat entrails, and the adults at the table are feasting on the head of a severed head of an aristocrat. Um, and it's basically this is the Frenchman's workday, right? And they go out and they butcher some aristocrats, and they come home and they eat their it's ridiculous, but it does kind of, it's satire. It exaggerates some of the attitudes that we actually see in Britain. Um, we have the partitions of Poland, are another European response to revolutionary activity. Poland was a country that had over the course of the 18th century that had come under the influence of its more powerful neighbors, Russia, the Austrian Empire, and Prussia. And its political instability, especially during the period of the French Revolution, made it a target. Under the auspices of a political vacuum forming on the frontiers of their three kingdoms. Poland was partitioned between Austria, Prussia, and Russia three times between 1772 and 1795. 1795, Poland is essentially taken off the map and will not appear until after World War I. So Poland will not be reconstituted as a state until 1919. Okay? And we can see, for instance, here's the territory Russia gains in the first partition, the second partition, and the third. Austria only participates in the first and third. Prussia, in three successive partitions, gets this whole territory over here. Now, that's what's going on in the rest of Europe during the Revolution. How do the French respond? Well, they respond under pressure with terror, with bloody execution. It radicalizes the revolution under this military pressure. A constitutional convention is formed upon the execution of Louis XVI. But because the old constitution is no longer valid, it no longer has a functioning executive, the constitutional convention essentially is the government. So what the delegates to the convention do is they establish a committee on public safety that basically runs the country as a kind of caretaker until the new constitution is finally drafted and its members can be elected. The members of the Committee on Public Safety will really be the power brokers in France during this time. They tended to be firm Republicans. They did not believe at all in constitutional monarchy. They even opposed the moderate Girondists, who had been so formidable in the early days of the Revolution. And when in June of 1793, the sans-culottes, those sort of radical lower middle class types in Paris, demand the expulsion of the sans-culottes, the radicals begin the left wing Jacobins begin to do that. They also issue a levy en masse. In other words, there's a mass mobilization of the French population into the military in order to defend the state from its foreign enemies. The Reign of Terror is also characterized by the so-called Republic of Virtue. It wasn't just enough that everyone was equal under the law or everyone practiced that freedom, but they had to strive to be good. They had to strive to be virtuous citizens, really dedicated to pursuing good public moral values. And I mean that public morality, as opposed to just morality in general. They had to be good citizens. Republican virtue was highly valued, as against the aristocratic excesses of the past. The Bible, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was what they used. His social contract was what was sort of compulsory reading. Streets are renamed with values, as opposed to the old saints that had typically provided street names. And if you weren't a good believer in the Democratic Republic, then you could be treated brutally. You could find that you were put in prison, face a tribunal, and perhaps even execution. At the same time, as radical as all of this was, we have to remember that the French Revolution was no friend of women. Women belonged in a separate sphere of life. The Society of Revolutionary Women was suppressed, and Olympe de Gouges, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, is executed in November of 1793. It is just too far for even someone like a Maximilien Robespierre, who is himself the leader of the Committee on Public Safety and fairly radical himself. Robespierre leads the charge, along with the rest of the committee, to de-Christianize France. A new calendar of 3 10-day weeks is adopted. Christianity is essentially banned. Notre Dame is converted from a Catholic church to a temple of reason, okay? The new cult of reason, the cult of the supreme being. A deistic kind of religion takes the place of traditional Christianity, in which a divine force is what animates the universe, what makes all things happen. And that's what rational people ought to be worshiping, ought to be celebrating on the 10th day of each week. Clergy are attacked, they are killed. Oftentimes, clergy are responsible for leading counter revolutionary activities, especially in the west of France. Churches are defaced, sometimes they're destroyed. And anyone, whether they be priests or radical women who are considered to be enemies of the Republic, are tried and executed in very quick tribunals. And here is an image from the so-called cult of the Supreme Being that takes the place of Christianity, at least officially in French life, for a brief period of time in 1794. Robespierre really wanted Robespierre felt that to simply de-Christianize France was not appropriate. That French people needed some kind of spiritual centering. So he had this ideology of the Supreme Being developed, and this large paper mache mountain erected in the center of Paris, and all these virgins dressed in bright colors lining this mountain, and from the top emerges Robespierre in a toga, and it's all supposed to be very rational and it seems to us, of course, sheer lunacy, and many people, as a matter of fact, saw it as that at that moment that Robespierre himself had sort of lost touch with reality in this one. Who is he, God, or even not? If he thinks he's God, he's Moses, right, coming down from the mountain, delivering the law from on high to the people. This was a last straw for many people. Um, in At the same time that he's taking these steps towards the cult of Supreme Being, he is also taking measures against, on one side, radical sans-culottes, okay, but also other Republicans who were more aligned with the Girondists. Georges Danton, for instance, who was so instrumental in the early days of the Revolution, of defending France, of inspiring the French to join the ranks of the army and repel those Austrian and Prussian invaders in the dark days of late 1791, early 1792. Danton goes to the guillotine. Robespierre, seems like he's sort of come a bit unglued. In June, the month after the call to the Supreme Being, the law of 22nd Prairial is passed, in which there is little or no evidence necessary now, legally, for tribunal convictions and therefore executions. In late June, he makes his greatest blunder, where he makes an accusatory speech in the floor of the convention, and he says I have a list of enemies of the state. And when he is pressed to say, who's on the list, he refuses to answer. It's sort of this idle threat. And the problem with that, of course, is that everyone in that convention chamber thought that, well, perhaps they could be on the list. And so therefore, Robespierre, in one fell swoop, had made an enemy who had put fear in the heart of everyone who could potentially oppose him. And so, rather than let him now simply hold the entire French government in fear, they struck back at him. And on the 9th of Thermidor, he is shouted down as he rises to make a speech by the delegates. He is arrested as an enemy of the French Republic, and he is summarily taken to the tribunal, his head shaved, and he meets the same fate that so many had before he went to the guillotine. And that really is the end of the Reign of Terror. There will be some more comeuppance after that for former terrorists, as they're known. However, the new constitution is waiting in the wings. The foreign wars are over, and as a result, there is really no need for that kind of heavy-handed radicalism from the dark days of the Reign of Terror. Now, we have one final installment where we will look at the so-called Thermidorian reaction in a bit greater detail, and the rise of that Corsican artillerist, Napoleon Bonaparte. For now, however, thank you for listening.